Hey folks, Brian here with the Coastal Patrol Cub. Wanted to take some time while I was flying today. An absolutely beautiful day here in Central Virginia. September 1st and just perfect weather. A little bit of low fog, some patchy fog in areas and low scud, but really just a beautiful day. Anyway, all that to say is I wanted to do a quick video here about a topic that I recently saw come up in a Facebook group. So I'm in a couple of Facebook groups that talk about Civil Air Patrol history. You know, have a focus on that, which of course, you know, I'm interested in. And had a really interesting conversation come up. So an individual posted talking about the fact that the Civil Air Patrol during World War II did not actually sink any submarines. And before y'all jump into the comments on this, just know that for one, I'm probably going to do a whole video about that specific topic later. And for two, he's right. Okay, just plain and simple, he's right. I know that for many, many years, because I mean, I was a cadet in Civil Air Patrol when I was a kid, too many years ago. And for many, many years, Civil Air Patrol official story that was taught to its members was that Civil Air Patrol sank 2 submarines during World War II. I know that was taught for a long time. However, that is incorrect, and frankly, we have the proof of that. So a gentleman named Frank Blazich, and Frank, if you're watching this, I apologize if I mispronounced that, but Frank Blazich was the Civil Air Patrol National Historian for a time, and he's actually a curator with the Smithsonian, so I mean, some very obvious historian bona fides here. He actually did a real deep dive on the subject. He had an article in Air Power magazine that covered that specific subject, and he also has a great book that I will link to. I'll link to both the article in the magazine and the book in the description here so you can read more about it. But essentially, Frank dug through all the records to include the records from the Germans of their submarine losses and where and when and all those sorts of things that they were able to determine. And through all this research concluded that no, at very least I will say highly, highly unlikely that we ever actually sank any submarines. And when you look at where did that story come from, again, it's very interesting, and I will do a whole video on that. But that's not the point of what I wanted to talk about today. What I wanted to talk about today was in that conversation, which again is in a Facebook group of people who are talking about Civil Air Patrol history. So you think you got your membership in that group skews towards people who know Civil Air Patrol and know Civil Air Patrol's history and are interested in that. And even within that kind of self-selected group, right? There were several people within that thread who seemed to be unaware that Civil Air Patrol airplanes were actually armed and attacking German submarines during the war, which I found fascinating. Like there were people who either thought that had no idea that we had done that at all. They're like, oh man, you know, what do you mean Civil Air Patrol dropped bombs? Or they were misinformed in that, oh yeah, I heard they had like hand-dropped bombs and, you know, whatever, and maybe they dropped some bombs on a couple whales thinking they were submarines, right? Like just completely unaware of Civil Air Patrol's history in this regard, which I thought was, again, really interesting for starters, that some people in this group did not know this. And obviously, personally, I was very disappointed because, man, whether or not we actually successfully sank any submarines, there's no doubt that Civil Air Patrol's efforts in the Atlantic during World War II were critical. And so I just wanted to talk about that for a little bit, about like what we actually did, where you know, where it all came from, how it developed, and what our accomplishments really were at that time. So I'll start with just a basic primer for some of those of you who are not very familiar with Civil Air Patrol. So Civil Air Patrol was founded in December of 1941. Civil Air Patrol kind of counts its birthday as December 1st, 1941, because that was when, you know, one piece of paperwork was signed, but then there's another thing that was signed on December 8th, of course, immediately after Pearl Harbor. But the point was that even before we actually entered the war, of course, the forming of Civil Air Patrol wasn't like someone just woke up on December 1st and said, hey, we should do this, and, you know, signed a paper, right? Obviously, it had been in the works for a while. So even before we entered World War II, people recognized that we were going to need a force like this. And now when I say Civil Air Patrol, obviously Civil Air Patrol, even in the war years, was much more than just the Coastal Patrol, right? We did a lot of stuff, you know, a lot of pilot training. We did all sorts of things during the war years, both within the continental U.S. as well as doing the Coastal Patrol over the Atlantic. But all that to say is December 1st, 1941, that's what we call CAP's birthday. So early December 1941, we've been formed. I think it's fair to say that World War II caught a lot of America flat-footed, right? Not everybody. There was a period of time there before the war, you know, I'm not going to do a full history course here, but there were a lot of people who wanted to prepare and get ready for war, and there were a lot of people who wanted to stay out of everything. And there were things that were done that were hedging our bets a little bit to try, you know, some people, like we started training up a ton of civilian pilots, right? And you have the kind of civilian reasoning for that of like, hey, commercial aviation is burgeoning, we're going to need all these pilots, you know, they put some national effort into getting people into aviation and training up pilots. But then you also have some people know we're going to need pilots for the Air Force here pretty soon, right? But people don't realize, when they think about the Army that we won World War II with, right? And this massive force that we were able to put together did not exist at the beginning of the war. So we were caught very flat-footed in a lot of ways. And so in the early period of the war, of course, you know, Pearl Harbor happens, we declare war, Germany jumps in, you know, all these things. And so now we're a fair target. So one of the first things we're doing in the Atlantic side of things is trying to supply Britain and trying to keep Britain from collapsing, from falling, because we know how much harder the war will become if that were to happen. And so we're sending a lot of supplies, so we're sending a lot of oil tankers, and we're just getting ravaged by the U-boats. And because again, we're not prepared. We're not able to defend them. So with that, you know, several people are like, hey, Civil Air Patrol can potentially start doing these patrols of the Atlantic to help spot submarines. That was kind of the first thing. And not only spot submarines, spot, you know, shipwrecked sailors, all these other things. And so some effort was put into that regard. We started forming up these coastal patrol, you know, kind of looking at what that would work. Interestingly, again, I mentioned there's a lot of oil tankers being lost. And again, these are civilian ships. These are civilian ships with civilian crews, right? The oil companies are actually like, man, we've had enough of this. It was actually the oil companies that provided a lot of the funding for early Civil Air Patrol, coastal patrol operations. They got together and put in a big chunk of that bill to help try and protect their own assets, right? Anyway, so we start putting together this idea of like, hey, we can start using the Civil Air Patrol to patrol these, to patrol the coast to watch out for submarines. I'm going to pause here to note that during World War II, across Civil Air Patrol, to include the Coastal Patrol, CAP did not own any airplanes, right? These were all member-provided airplanes. All of the pilots, all of the people in Civil Air Patrol are volunteers, even in those days. They did get some stipends for, you know, living on base and what have you, but they were all volunteers. There was a lot of folks who wanted to serve, but they're medically disqualified or what have you. I actually have a great uncle of mine who obviously he's passed several years ago. He was a Civil Air Patrol member for like 60-something years. He joined in World War II and he was a member until the day he died. But that was his story, right? He was medically disqualified from serving. He could not join the military. So he joined the Civil Air Patrol. It's the next best thing you can do. So anyways, you got a lot of that. And so they had this idea of taking these civilian volunteers and their civilian airplanes and setting them up to go patrol the Atlantic coast. So initially started with 2 bases in the pilot program. They started with Atlantic City, New Jersey, and then Rehoboth, Delaware. Operations commenced in March of 1942, so you think, we as an organization, we only came into existence in December, and now here we are in March of the following year, and we're starting to fly these coastal patrol missions. The original concept of operations was flying in flights of either 2 to 3 airplanes, at least 2 people on each one, a pilot and a radio operator. And it was a mix of, again, all member-provided airplanes, but Stinson 105s were extremely popular. The Fairchild F-24 was extremely popular. The Grumman Widget was used. There's a number of different airplanes used. So they were going out there in pairs, looking for anything, right? Obviously looking for submarines, but again, looking for any signs of shipwrecks, oil slicks, any obviously survivors, that sort of thing. So more than just U-boats, but U-boats is obviously a big concern at this time. Literally the first, Delaware's base flew the first patrol, but then when Atlantic City came on like a day or 2 later, on their first patrol out of Atlantic City, they spotted shipwreck survivors from a merchant ship that had been torpedoed and radioed him to get them rescued. Literally our first time out of Atlantic City, one of our first patrols of the entire war, and we already are providing value, right? At this time, were they to find a U-boat, their only course of action was to try and keep an eye on it, keep its position, and radio back to the mainland for someone to come do something about it, right? For some of these military aircraft that were stationed on the coast to come try and attack this thing. Well, I mentioned earlier that the war caught us very flat-footed, right? There's a reason we're being pressed into service to even do the patrols in the first place, is because the military is kind of lacking those resources that I'm sure it would like to have. So it was not uncommon for us to call stuff in and unfortunately nobody be available to do anything about it. And it really came to a head. There's one instance in particular that's often cited that a Civil Air Patrol came across a German U-boat that had been grounded unintentionally and was stuck. And they circled this thing for 45 minutes while it sat there floundering, and no one was available to come attack it. No one could get out there, and it eventually worked its way free and got away. So that instance, among others, and among just the general pressure, some folks in Civil Air Patrol and in the Army Air Corps were saying, like, hey, could we harm Civil Air Patrol airplanes? Could we put bombs on these things? And it was eventually determined that, yes, we can try this. And in May of 1942, so now March to May, now we're beginning to arm the airplanes. And they modify the airplanes to put on actual bomb shackles, and they are getting armed with a variety of bombs. 100-pound general purpose bombs is very common, especially on the Stinson 105 was an extremely common airplane, and that was all it could take was one 100-pound general purpose bomb. The Fairchilds and the Widgeons can carry more, so we do 100-pound general-purpose bombs, but they also had, 250-pound bombs and 300-pound depth charges, were the 3 different types of armaments we carried. The armaments themselves on the ground were controlled by the military, and then they were loaded onto our airplanes. But it's just a really fascinating piece of history that, yes, civilian pilots flying civilian airplanes that they owned were carrying live bombs provided by the military and attacking military targets. Sometimes they'd have crewed bomb sites. They did put the air crews through some training with the Army Air Corps. The Navy, I believe, provided some training on bombing these targets. So yeah, we tried it.
Okay, so with that all said, how effective was Civil Air Patrol's bombing efforts during World War II anyway? Well, just as a reminder, the vast majority of the bombs we carried were 100-pound general purpose bombs. This is an example of that. This is a replica, just a plastic model, but it is true to scale. So you can see that's not a lot, right? That is really really not very significant. I'm going to step back a little bit so you can see it in relation to the airplane. It's not a very large bomb. They actually did studies on this during World War II and determined that you could theoretically sink a submarine with a 100-pound general purpose bomb, but it would have to be a direct hit on the pressure vessel to have any chance whatsoever. When you're talking about civilian airplanes that were not designed to be bombers, civilian crews that were, trained, but not a ton of training, and no, accurate bomb sights, all those sorts of things. Yeah, highly unlikely that you're going to actually take anything out with something like this. Now, as far as the 250-pound and 300-pound, 250-pound bombs and 300-pound depth charges, obviously slightly increases your chances, but still. Did we damage some submarines? Probably. I would say, yeah, we probably did. And that's not to say that, the only measure of effectiveness is actually sinking a submarine. Again, we attacked 57 submarines, we dropped 82 bombs, and that's going to have an impact on their operations. It's going to force them to submerge, to change locations, to knock off their patrol, whatever they're doing. And certainly if they're damaged, that's going to impact them. And then not to say anything of all the subs that we certainly called into the military to go investigate and potentially do something about. So we definitely had an impact there. And then again, one of our big impacts was really a mission that continues to this day, which is our search and rescue, right? We spotted down or survivors, shipwreck survivors of ships that have been struck or, whatever. We did a lot of that. We spotted downed aviators, from airplanes that had crashed or been shot down or what have you. So certainly a lot came out of the coastal patrol more than just attacking submarines. But it is something, yes, Civil Air Patrol aircraft were armed. We did carry actual real bombs, and we did actually attack submarines. That is all truth. That happened. It's an important part of our history, and it definitely should be something that we talk about and acknowledge. At the end of the day, was bombing submarines our only thing in the coastal patrol in World War II? Was that the most important thing even? I would argue not necessarily. It was important. It did happen, and it's something that I think people should know about and should know that it is something that actually took place in our nation's history. We took civilian planes and civilian pilots and we put bombs on them and sent them to attack the enemy. And that's something that's really cool. It's a unique part of our history, and it's something that, again, I think everyone in the Civil Air Patrol certainly should know. And it surprises me that there are folks who don't. So hopefully this video helps affect that a little bit, and it's a unique part, again, of our history that I think we should all be proud of. But let's also not lose sight of the fact, even if we did not actually sink any submarines directly, again, we had an impact. We had an impact on the war effort. We had an impact on certainly operations in the Atlantic while the military was getting built up and while they were getting more capable to deal with these threats. So again, I hope this video helps. I hope you all found it interesting, and I hope to do more stuff like this soon.